Joel, really appreciate you joining us. On this show, we talk about a lot of different issues surrounding the supernatural. We talk about spiritual warfare and so much more. And this issue of Christian persecution is an incredibly important one for people to understand, but in particular, Christians. And Syria is a country you and CSI have talked quite a bit about, but a lot of people don't know. They don't know what is happening there. So from a 30,000-foot view, can you tell us over the last year in particular, what has been happening and what is currently happening when it comes to persecution there in Syria?
Yeah, so about 9 months ago, maybe 10 months ago, the dictatorship of Syria was overthrown by a coalition of jihadist rebel groups. The dictatorship of Syria, run by President Bashar al-Assad, was incredibly brutal, astronomically brutal, but it was secular. So it did maintain the Christian population in Syria. We can say it was not hostile to the existence of Christians in Syria. The new rulers of Syria are quite different. The new president of Syria is the founder of Al-Qaeda's Syria branch. He officially split with Al-Qaeda some years ago, but he's given very little indication that his ideology has really changed. And when he first took power in December last year, he promised that Christians would be safe, that other religious minorities in Syria, like the Alawites, like the Druzes, would be safe. And they were safe for a few months. But beginning in March, we began to see huge massacres, especially of Alawites and of Druzes. Christians haven't been massacred on the same scale, but we've had a suicide bombing in the church in Damascus, which is something that has never happened before in Syrian history. And the government's reaction to that was not very encouraging, to say the least. And we're starting to see Christian political figures or Christian prominent people getting silenced or arrested. Especially, I'm thinking today of a man named Suleiman Khalil, who was the mayor of a Christian town named Saadad, who successfully fought off ISIS in 2015. When the government was not around to help, he basically helped to save the town. And he was arrested in February by the new government. And he's been held without a lawyer and without being able to talk to his family ever since. At CSI, we know Suleiman. He's a friend of ours. We've met him several times. And we are campaigning for his release.
Wow. As you're talking about this, I'm thinking through, there's so many levels of this. You have a country that has been through so much, right? Politically, socially, but this religious, this sort of faith underpinning of this conflict. I want to dig a little bit more into Ahmed al-Sharaa, the president of Syria, because this is a person, as you said, part of Al-Qaeda fought U.S. troops. Did he not fight U.S. troops on the ground at one point?
In Iraq.
Okay.
Yep.
Iraq.
Started his career fighting American troops in Iraq. He was inspired by the 9/11 attacks to join Al-Qaeda, and then traveled to Iraq to fight the Americans. That was the beginning of his career.
And you talk about the spiritual nature of these things and evil, and how evil we have seen throughout all of these events, through 9/11, through the persecution that is happening there. He stood in front of the New York skyline this week in New York and spoke to the UN as it's almost mind-boggling. Can you just reflect on that a little bit? Because I don't think people realize that this Al-Qaeda member is now the president of Syria and got to come to America and speak in front of the world.
It is really extremely troubling, Billy, and something that when I was younger and 9/11 was still fresher in my memory, I couldn't have imagined that this would actually happen. But yeah, so this former member of Al-Qaeda, who still adheres to Islamism, who still adheres to a jihadist ideology, is welcomed in New York, gets a special event with General David Petraeus. They sit together on a stage and they have a nice conversation. David Petraeus addresses him as Sayyid al-Rais, like, Your Excellency, Mr. President. He gives a speech at the UN. As you mentioned, he takes a selfie with his foreign minister in front of the New York skyline, with his foreign minister gesturing at the skyline. And for Americans, we can't help but notice that there are two buildings that are not there anymore in that skyline because of the group that the Syrian president used to belong to. And I'm not sure many people realize this, but The U.S. actually has a long history of collaborating with Islamist groups in Afghanistan, for example, and other places, usually because we think we can turn them to our advantage. But usually it's pretty much under wraps. Usually they don't like brag about it. But for some reason, they decided that they can make this guy the public face of their new Syria policy. And I think within a few years, this is going to look like one of the biggest mistakes in foreign policy history.
You know, I'm just thinking about the people on the ground in Syria, because what I don't want people to do is to, as we're talking about this, it sounds so political and it sounds so, we're talking facts and figures and people, but there are real human beings, Christians and other minority groups on the ground. What can you tell us? And I know CSI, you hear a lot, you do a lot of work on the ground, you help a lot of, beleaguered Christians around the world. What else is happening to those minority groups right now when it comes to fear, when it comes to, daily life? Because even though things were not good before under the last regime, this is a lot different. This is a lot more intense. We live in America, where Jen and I, where things are, we can go to church, we can do these things. What's happening there when it comes to
all day long? Yeah.
So at the level of daily life, the police and the security forces in Syria are now former rebels, many of them former jihadists, and they have their own value sets, right? And they're starting to impose those value sets on the people that they're responsible for policing. So what we're starting to see more and more is if they see a man and a woman together in the street, they'll force them to separate unless one of them can show that they have a marriage certificate. If they see a man wearing shorts, they'll tell him to go home and change. If they see a woman with her hair uncovered, they'll tell her to go home and change. They're harassing shops that sell alcohol. And these kind of slow changes on the ground are turning the tide of Syrian society in a much more Islamic direction than it has been for the past half century. And what we saw at the beginning of this new government was that whenever this sort of thing would happen, the new government would react very strongly and say, no, we didn't order that. That's not what we want. We're going to reprimand these policemen. People should dress how they want. People should do what they want. We're not going to change Syria. That is happening less and less. And in fact, the government itself is starting to impose Islamic-style regulations on the population. For example, issuing a national decree about what kinds of bathing suits are permissible for men and women. So that's at the level of daily life, I would say. Much more sinister, a lot of kidnappings are happening, especially among women from the Alawite Muslim religious community. A lot of women are disappearing on the way to school, on the way to work, and they're just not showing up again. Sometimes their families get calls asking for ransom. Sometimes they get calls saying your daughter is a good Muslim now, she's not coming back to you. And sometimes they hear nothing. And for those of you who recall the ISIS genocide in Iraq, one of the main things they did was target a religious group called the Yazidis. They killed all the men and they started abducting and enslaving the women. That was their program, because the Yazidis are a religious group that in the jihadist ideology, it's permitted to treat this way. The Alawites are the same in the jihadist ideology, and we're starting to see the same thing.
So can you define the Alawites for me? I've heard that term, but is it sort of like two different denominations of Christianity, obviously, and it's extreme, it's demonic, it's not Christianity, but would it be the kind of the equivalent of we are all Islamic, but we're on this side and you're on this side, so therefore we don't get along? Is that really what it is?
I think the best analogy is Alawitism is to Islam as Mormonism is to Christianity. All right. So Alawites would call themselves Muslims. They revere Muhammad. They revere Allah. But they're very different from other Muslims. And most other Muslims do not regard them as Muslims. Alawites,
I wouldn't say Mormons or Christian at all.
Right. There are fundamental differences between mainstream Christianity and Mormonism. In the same way, Alawites will drink alcohol. Alawites don't seek to convert other people to Alawism. Alawites will only marry within their community. They have mystical beliefs about reincarnation. They believed that the son-in-law of Muhammad was divine. I mean, these are very strange beliefs for most Muslims. But they are about 10% of Syria's population. And during the civil war, a huge dynamic was these people looked across the barrier and saw that the rebels were almost entirely Islamists or jihadists or Sunni Muslims. And they thought, if these people take over, we are not going to be safe. And in fact, that fear is what helped to keep the Assad dictatorship in power as long as it did. And now that the Assad dictatorship is gone, these fears are starting to be realized, unfortunately.
Oh my gosh, I have so many questions, but I think so people understand, because I think a lot of people in the West, they look at this and they're like, but I don't get it. What is the goal here? What is the president of Syria, his ideology, right? We know about 9/11. We know what Al-Qaeda has been responsible for. We know he's a former member of that. What is this ideology? Why is the ideology so bent on stopping other groups like the Alawites, but also Christians, anybody who does not subscribe to it? Why is it so bent on that? Like, can you take us through that?
Sure. So the ideology of what we might call Salafism or Wahhabism or jihadism, it's a very extreme version of Sunni Islam. And it really sees the world as fundamentally impure, and the world has to be purified of the impure people, especially the lands that belong to Islam eternally, which is any land that has ever been majority Muslim. So for these people, the fact that an Alawite, Bashar al-Assad, was president of Syria was a huge religious offense. In their mind, that should never have happened. Alawites should never have been allowed to live in Syria, much less become the president of Syria. So a lot of the rebellion against Assad got tied up into this religious hatred against this specific religious group. In this ideology, Christians are technically allowed to live and have their property as long as they stay in submission to Muslims, as long as they stay in like a second rank and can't testify against Muslims in court, can't own weapons, have to pay extra taxes, all these little legal disabilities that fundamentally would make it impossible for modern Christians to live in such a state. As to why, I think the sheer brutality of the war in Syria made a brutal ideology like this appealing to a lot of people. And now that they've won, a lot of them think that this is their time to take what they were promised, to take land that belongs to Alawites, to take their property, to take their women. They have a religious license to do this now, and it's going to be very difficult to stop them.